Good morning. Great to be here. My name's Robert Sell, and today I'll be talking to you about insider threats and the risk to organizations. And just a quick show of hands, how many of you have played the game Among Us? Yeah, okay, great. I was really hoping I would see a few hands because my artwork is really from that game. And the inspiration for this talk is really a result of that game. So my kids would play this game with me, and they would kill me over and over and over again. And it really drove home the point of how important insider threat risk is for me. So you'll see the artwork throughout this presentation. Now, some quick introductions. Who am I? Why am I up here? My life is really broken into several different buckets. The first one is Trace Labs. So you may know me from Trace Labs. Trace Labs is a nonprofit organization, and we crowdsource open source intelligence to help law enforcement find missing persons. And if you're interested in that, if that sounds interesting to you, we are doing a CTF here tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. in the contest area. If you'd like to sign up, you can see me afterwards. There is also a link on the DefCamp website, so you can register there as well. So we'll be looking for actual real missing persons. Also, next year we'll be launching Alpha Omega, so I'm the founder of that. And the inspiration of that really came from this talk and finding out the importance of insider threat and how we want to mitigate that. So next year we'll be doing some workshops that are really focused on, I'm going to call them spy schools, where we actually teach you how people do corporate espionage and then how you can take that information and protect your company against that. So we'll be launching that next year. And then the other big part of my life is search and rescue. The reason that's relevant to all of you is because I'm a certified tracker within that area. And there's a lot of carryover from physical tracking in Canada, where I live, and open source intelligence. Tracking has been around for years. Since we discovered that animals were tasty to eat, we started tracking. So it's much older and has a much more knowledge and fundamentals and frameworks than our OSINT does, right? So there's a lot of carryover with that. And then finally, I've been in the industry for a few decades, and I am lucky enough to work at a company that's probably one of the #1 companies for getting attacked. So I get exposure to a number of a good variety of attacks and experiences that way. So that's who I am. If any of those things are interesting to you, I'm always happy to collaborate and answer any questions that you might have. All right, quick disclaimer, I just have to do this. All of these opinions are my own, and they don't reflect any employer that I might have. They're all for lawful use only. It's all public, so feel free to share it. And then finally, I only have about 45 minutes with you, so I'm only going to scrape the surface of insider threat, hopefully kind of pique your curiosity and show you some of the things that you can take away back to your company and help your teams with. But there's a huge amount of detail here that I won't be covering just because there's a time restriction. Now, when I'm in your seats, I'm always thinking, okay, what's going to happen for the next 45 minutes? So this is a picture of our journey here today and what we're going to go through. So first, I want to go through and make sure we all understand what is insider threat. And the reason we need to do that is because I don't think our industry has done a great job in really defining that and making that super clear. And then finally, once we understand it, how do we prevent it? How do we reduce our risk? And then if we don't prevent it and it occurs, how do we actually even detect it? How do we know it's happening? And then how do we respond once it does occur? And then what I also want to do is give you at the very end of this talk a strategy, a takeaway that you can then go back to your company with and talk to your teams and say, hey, are we doing this? And what is our risk profile with insider threat? So that's our journey. So we're going to start off with understanding. That's always a good place to start. And I want to show you a couple definitions of insider threat. One is pretty bad, and one is, I think, much better, right? So we often talk about exploiting the vulnerabilities of a company and the intent to cause harm, which is actually wrong, right? So when we talk about insider threat, there's sometimes no intent. What I think is a much better example, right, is potential for an insider to use their authorized access or just even an understanding of your organization, right? So they don't necessarily even have to have access, as long as they understand how you operate. And then the harm can include malicious, complacent, or unintentional. And that's a key point, right? The unintentional. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit as we progress through this talk. But I think that second definition is much better. Why should you care? That's the other big thing that I always think about, right? You have many priorities in your job. When you go back to your company, you have a long list of things to do. Why would insider threat or corporate espionage be something that you should put on your radar or care about, right? Well, these numbers are why. And these numbers are a few years old, so the new numbers are even worse, right? So if we do a quick look at this, 2,500 breaches in this area in the US every day. That's a lot, right? 34% are impacted every year around the world. So what that would mean is if your company doesn't have an insider threat issue last year or the year before, this year could be your lucky year, right? So the law of thirds. And then over the last 2 years, the number has grown by 47%. Let's round up to 50%. So if your crypto investment was growing by 50%, you'd be pretty happy, right? That's a tremendous growth. So that's how fast this is growing. And then finally, you see some numbers there on the cost of the damage. And those numbers are in the millions, so it's a big number. But I think that that's even too low, right? Because when we're talking about insider threat, we're talking about people that are in your organization that are causing damage that you may not be aware of, that are giving your information to competitors, and that takes years to process, right? For your competitors to grow as a result of that data exfil. So I don't think we have a clear idea of the true damage that occurs with that, right? But you can imagine how big it is. It's probably the end, easily the end of an organization if it happens too much. That's why it's important. And that's bad, but it's even worse. Right? So when we talk about the more sophisticated corporate espionage, a lot of that, of course, is going to be state-funded. And I'm going to pick on China because this is in the news quite a bit. But they have the National Intelligence Law, Article 14. You can look this up. It's been out for a few years. But basically, the state now has the right to turn any of their citizens or organizations into spies. You could argue that any country could do that, but China's in the news quite a bit for doing that, and we see that quite often, right? So heavily funded professional organizations or governments sponsoring this, right, to make it even worse. So that's why we should care. Now, to fully understand insider threat and the nuances of it, what I've done is broken it up into different categories, and then within those categories, we have different types. And the reason we want to do that is because not all insider threat is the same. There's nuances. And those nuances will allow us to provide better responses, appropriate investment, and proper controls to mitigate that risk, right? So we're going to talk about intent. We're going to talk about what is the trigger mechanism for that, because sometimes that's occurring within your own company to turn people into insider threat. And you can control that very easily, right? And then the level of sophistication that we're going to see with these different types of insider threats. So that's what we're going to cover here just now. And the first one is what we call pawns. And there's two types of pawns. These are the least sophisticated type of insider threat, but also the most common, what we see out there. We see this a lot. So they're typically innocent, and they don't have the intent to cause harm. They don't mean to cause all this damage. They may even regret and have great sadness when they discover what they have done to the company, right? So, and they may even not notice they've caused this mistake. And when they're not victims, the other type of pawn is often just lazy, and they ignore policy, and they just don't care. So that's kind of the general pawn category. And within the pawn category, we have two different types. And the first one is accidental. Accidentals, this is the employee who is harming the company, but without intent. They're innocent. usually short lapses of judgment. So these are the people that don't have great judgment necessarily, or perhaps they just never got appropriate training, which is often the case. So, and they can be very upset when they find out that this has happened to them, right? And especially when you make them aware of their mistake. These are sometimes the social butterflies, and they're perfect for social engineering attacks. So when I did the DEFCON CTF, the social engineering CTF there at DEFCON Vegas, these are the people that I looked for. And within every company, there's usually 5 to 3% of the people out there that you can find that are inappropriately posting your corporate data on the internet. That can be your VPN, what kind of badge you use for door entry, all of that information, right? So a typical scenario for this would be, of course, a phishing attack where they click the link, then their computer becomes a slave, or they get the malware, or more likely the ransomware. This is an example of that. Many of you might recognize this. So a few years ago, Twitter had this problem where, I think it was during COVID actually, and their employees were tricked by an outside group posing to be Twitter administrators. Twitter was working from home, or now X was working from home during this time, so it was hard to validate that they weren't actual real IT administrators. That got them the credentials, which then allowed them to modify some pretty high-profile accounts on Twitter and then post some outrageous tweets. You'll probably remember that. But that's a classic accidental pawn scenario, right? The second type of pawn is what we call the lazy pawn, right? And no intent to cause harm, but they don't really care if it happens, right? They just can't be bothered. So they don't care about your policies. It's way too much effort for them to follow the policies or procedures, right? You're probably thinking, oh, I know somebody like that. No remorse. So if it does cause damage, whatever, right? There's no concern because there's probably no punishment because the policies are probably not heavily enforced, right? So if you're enforcing your policies, this is much less likely to happen, right? And a scenario that you might see there is they leave their laptop out in public, or maybe it's important papers they leave out in public. This is the person that never logs off their computer when they go for lunch, they just leave it open. That sort of scenario. Here's an example of the lazy type of pawn. This was a Russian nuclear scientist, amazing access to amazing computer, and they decided that this might be a good idea to mine crypto on this, right? Obviously, a poor lapse of judgment there. They got caught. FSB investigated them, and I think they ended up in jail. But they just didn't care about the policy, right? This is a kind of a blatant example of that. Now we're going to move into the next category of insider threat, and this becomes a little more sophisticated. We're just going to move away from the pawns into what we call turncloaks. And there's two types of turncloaks, and they're much more sophisticated than pawns, and they're not victims. So turncloaks typically know what they're doing. And they're often driven to either cause harm or for personal gain. Those are kind of the two types that we see. The first type of turncloak is what we call the career-based turncloak. And this one actually is very common. No intent to cause harm directly, but they know that it will, right? So they basically want to exfil all of their personal data so they can take it with them when they go to their next employer. I'm sure many of you have seen this, right? When I worked as an IT administrator, I always knew when someone was leaving the company because they would come up to me and say, hey, Rob, can I have a CD or a DVD or a USB key? I was like, oh, okay, so you're going to pull all your data and then you're going to be gone in 2 weeks. So now, of course, they could use the cloud and other things. Oh, sorry, I'm just looking at the computer here. It's doing funny stuff. So that happens quite a bit. So that's something to watch out for. And then when you catch them, when you confront them, they often have magically forgotten all the rules and all the policies of not to do that. So that's the other one. A good example of this was a Google executive, worked for the Google self-driving program, which is now huge. They left the company. They took all of their personal data with them and actually thought, well, since I'm taking all my personal data, I'll just take all my project data and all the data that I can access around the program while I'm doing that, right? They left the company, started their own company for a self-driving truck startup, and then Uber bought it from him. So he made a lot of money as a result of that data exfil. He was, of course, caught and prosecuted for that, but that is a big example of how that can happen, right? So this is super common. I see this all the time. The second type of turncloak is the disgruntled one. And this is by far my favorite. I probably shouldn't be, but these are employees that become disgruntled yet won't leave the company. So they're happy to take a paycheck, but they're frustrated with their position in the company because something has happened to them. So something has happened to them in their employment there. Either they missed a promotion, or they don't like their manager, or something has happened to cause them to be disgruntled. And the company has not yet managed that person, right? So they are now primed to be an insider threat, right? And this can occur over time. A typical scenario for this would be they would distract other employees, they would encourage others to be unproductive, sabotage projects, introduce threats. So this is the big problem with this, right? Once an employee is disengaged and disgruntled, now they're much more likely to help an outside party with, say, malware or something like that. So if they get approached, they're much more open to that, right? They're no longer associating themselves as part of the company. So, but this is under the control of the company to fix at some point. An example of this is a disgruntled worker quits his job. Of course, this is quite often they don't quit and they stay with the company, which is even worse. But in this case, he quit his job. But of course, before he left, he changed the passwords of all the routers and then shut them down so they couldn't pass traffic. Of course, the company was paralyzed. They couldn't do anything. They found out, obviously, that it was him. They sued him for almost $1 million, and I think he might have gone to jail. So a completely avoidable situation. And we're going to talk about ways you can avoid this. But yeah, this is a typical disgruntled insider threat situation. Now we're going to move into imposters. And we've gone through the first two categories of insider threat. Now we're at imposters, which are really bad news. So these are the people that you won't see them in your organization, very professional. Pawns are sort of cute, you know, right? They're innocent, they don't mean to make mistakes. And turncloaks are interested in their careers, and they may be disgruntled, but you can understand their motives, right? Whereas the imposters, they're ghosts, very hard to detect and capture, right? They're often professionals, and they may take years to work through your company and exfil the data that they want. So the first type of imposter is the malicious type of imposter, right? So they feel the need to damage or quite often publicly expose your company. So this kind of feels similar to disgruntled, and it's very similar that way. However, they're not worried about engagement, or they didn't have anything that triggered them. They're just looking to expose your company, right? And a good scenario for this would be whistleblower or sabotage, and the classic example of this, of course, is Snowden. And I find whenever I talk about Snowden, it's either you love him or you hate him. But I think what's undeniable is he did cause a lot of harm to the CIA when he exposed some of the things that he did, right? So that's a kind of a classic malicious type example. And I'm not passing judgment on what he did. I'm just saying that that's an example of how it can cause damage to the entity, right? The next one is pirates, right? And I always think of Han Solo. Anybody who's a Star Wars fan, you know, Han Solo was in it for the money. Those are pirates, right? And a big focus for pirates will be malware or ransomware, rather. That's kind of a go-to. So the delivery of a USB key conveniently dropped in the appropriate place for people to plug in. What they want to do is probably sell your data or hold you ransom. That's usually an outside entity that's coming in and trying to work in partnership with somebody internally that's disgruntled, right? So that's where that partnership comes in. They'll cover their tracks fairly well. And a typical scenario of this is either a ransomware or selling your credentials or corporate data. A great example of this was with Tesla. So this was a few years ago now, and this is actually a good news story because there was an employee internal to Tesla, this really speaks to their company culture because they were approached by an outside entity and offered $500,000 to infect the Tesla infrastructure with ransomware. And the person actually turned them down, and not only turned them down, but then turned them in to law enforcement. So who knows if they would have actually made $500,000, but that's a pretty big payday to turn down, right? So obviously there was some company culture there that allowed them to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I mean, there's probably also the risk of getting caught, but I think the company culture there probably influenced them quite a bit as well. So you can see that companies can do things that will allow their employees to not become internal threats. The third type of imposter is what we call espionage. This is the scariest form of insider, right? So this is now we're starting to talk about nation-state funded insiders. They have the highest calling, highest monetary reward, backed by huge infrastructure, right? Usually formal training, repeated practice and experience, so they may do this for a living. These are ghosts and very difficult to detect. And they'll walk out of your building carrying your secrets, and you'll probably hold the door open for them as they walk out, right? Typical scenario is data exfil. I mean, that's what they're all about. They're not so much about exposing your company or disgruntled. They're running it like a business. And the interesting thing with this is they may have several years, so they may do this over time, and they may use different people, right? So they may send in an intern to do initial reconnaissance, and then they may send in another person to do data exfil or even more, right? So it can be very complex, and it can occur over a long period of time. A classic example of that is senior engineer at Raytheon. So any sort of aerospace or weapon platforms are high potential targets, right? Highly valued. This person stole military program documents and then, weirdly enough, emailed them, which you don't see very often as far as a method for data exfil, right? Usually it's some sort of dead drop or something that's very hard to detect. But so of course he got busted. But that's kind of the classic example of espionage type, right? So we've gone through the different categories and types of insider threat. We've seen that there's internal triggers for both pawns and turncloaks. There's intent for imposters and turncloaks. So we have an understanding that we can influence some of this, right? The risk begins when employees don't associate themselves with the organization. So if you have a disgruntled employee that doesn't care, you're much more likely to see that person turn into an insider threat. So the ability to control that is huge. Insider threats or people causing damage to the organization don't associate themselves as part of the family, right? As part of the corporate culture. The damage that they cause is totally acceptable to them mentally in that way, right? So then let's take a look at how we would prevent your organization. So preventing pawns. So what I've done here is there's four main areas that I focus on: training, corporate culture, management, and technical controls. You could expand this. This is just what I focused on. You could add more detail to this if you wanted to. But what I'm trying to show here is that for pawns, we've talked about the intent and how they evolve. Training is such a huge component to this. And it's several areas that I would really suggest. From part of my experience with the DEFCON social engineering CTF was that I would often talk to a receptionist. How many of you train your receptionist against these sort of attacks? My guess is the receptionist is not trained a lot, right? I would put investment there. They're often a bottleneck to that. So I would definitely do that. But there's other areas as well, right? Social engineering training, user awareness training, and training that's fun, not the type of training that you want to just click through as fast as you can. I know we all have exposure to that, but training that actually makes you want to do it and collaborate with team members on that, right, is very important. So the quality of your training actually matters. I also would look at corporate culture as a secondary investment. So corporate culture is easy to talk about. We all see the posters in the hallway about being a good employee and engaged. But I would focus on actual tangible activities like security champion program. So if you see good behavior, if you see somebody champion security, you reward them, and you let others see you reward that person. So everybody then wants to become a champion and move the culture forward. Preventing turncloaks. Now I put the box around all 4 areas because turncloaks are a little bit more sophisticated and you have to cover a little bit more ground there, right? But I would increase your training, make it more sophisticated, develop an employee engagement program, right? So formalize that a little bit more. Do surveys and understand why your employees aren't engaged or empowered, and then try to invest in areas where you can improve that and then detect issues. NDAs, formalize and make sure they're aware that the data is not theirs, that the data is the company's, right? Data loss prevention, you can invest in that. And then most importantly, enforce your policies and do so in a way that's public. So people know if they break the rules, then they're going to face the punishment, right? Because if they don't think they will, they're going to continue to move in that direction. And then finally, preventing imposters. So this is where much more effort goes into the technical controls. This is a much more sophisticated internal threat, right? So much different than from the first 2. So I would focus more on technical controls, and I would implement these throughout your organization. And some of these I look at, like the tamper-proof card access. Most of us have card access, but how many of you have made them tamper-proof, right? So you get an alarm when I pop it open and put a chip in there so that I can pull all the creds, right? So I don't see that very often. And then also developing a counter-espionage skill set. So many of you will have information security teams. How many of those teams actually have training in insider threat or corporate espionage, right? Making sure that you've got that training and awareness, and that's part of your day-to-day exercises. Okay, we're getting near the end. How do we detect if it does happen, right? We've done preparation, we understand what's going on now. How do we actually detect it if it's out there? And it is. I would bet that you have some level of this in all of your organizations, right? So there's really kind of 2 methods for detection. There's tools and there's behaviors. And ideally, you want to be focused on both of those, right? However, most of us don't have that investment, right? Companies have their SOC, but they don't necessarily have detection for insider threat as part of that. And then even fewer companies have dedicated staff to look at insider threat as well, right? If that's the case, what I would propose as a solution would be corporate culture, to really focus on that. If you can't scale your security staff, then really try to empower the whole company to help you with that, right? Through corporate culture investment, right? Have a program of if they see something, they say something, and they're rewarded for that. Otherwise, the behavior won't happen. Some indicators of compromise for management. So any managers out there, this may help you. I put this here with a little bit of, I'm a little bit careful because this could turn into a witch hunt if you just look at these and try to detect insider threat. These are just examples, and there's many more as well, right? But they're not all the signs that you could see, but there are many of them. So I would look at some key ones here, and if you see these popping up with your employees, it's time to take even more notice, especially if you see criminal activity, of course. And then for employees, there's similar type of behaviors that you would watch out for, right? Many of these, you'll see these happening, and if 1 or 2 happen, then it's probably not a concern, but if you see many of them happening over time, then that would be a bigger concern. And of course, also, you don't want to be accusing somebody of something just because you see some of these behaviors. So you need to very carefully approach this. Then finally, how would you respond? If you detect insider threat, you see it occurring, what would you do, right? Do you have a documented process for this? So what I would suggest is once we find insider threat, what do we do? So you should have a well thought out step-by-step process. This should be formalized. What you don't want to do is detect it and then try to figure out how to deal with this, right? And you also want to have a very good understanding of the nature of the event. So it can't be you're just guessing, you need to have evidence, because if you accuse someone of insider threat and you don't have the evidence, then of course you could run into legal action, right? So it has to be evidence, not hunches. And you also need to be working with HR and other departments to make sure you have a holistic approach to this, because it's going to be more than just information security involved in this. And you probably need to be bringing in law enforcement at that point, right, depending on the nature of the insider threat. And I would recommend you're continually working on this process as the threats change out there as well. All right, so we're almost there. We're just going to talk about strategy. So this is the one slide that I created so that you can take this away, take this back to your organization, have a discussion, and take a look at the overall strategy that you would have. So for response, a lack of response are going to encourage attackers, right? So if you have policies to protect your company against insider threat, but you're not enforcing them, then you can expect the behaviors to relate to that, right? So if there's no punishment in me taking all the data, I'm going to take all the data. So you must make sure that not only you have policies, but people are aware of them and you enforce them, right? Start easy. What I mean by that is we talked about the different categories of insider threat, the pawns and the turncloaks. Those are things that you can quite easily fix simply by looking at your company culture and detecting when people are disgruntled or not happy. Sitting down with your employees if they don't get the promotion that they were expecting and talking to them about how they're feeling, right? Or if there's something else going on in their life to really help them deal with that, right? I know that quite often that doesn't occur, and it's within your control to monitor and support your employees with that, right? Custom approach for each of the 3 different types here. So pawns, we talked about education, right? Really having a focus on that and trying to measure that. And not having just the click-through education, but make it fun, gamify it, right? So if somebody gets a high score in their training, give them a reward. Bring them in and help them to create new content, right? Make experts in your company outside of your information security groups. Turncloaks, company culture is the focus here, right? So we need to motivate them, have fun with the governing of that. So we don't want them taking your data outside the company, so we want to empower everyone to be on guard to monitor for that, right? Imposters, much more difficult, but not impossible. So we want to mature our controls and have a holistic mix of both technical and behavioral controls, right, on this. That's going to help you a lot. And then collaborate early. What I mean by that is, when was the last time you sat down with finance or HR or some of those other admin groups and talked to them about what if this happens? What if we have an insider threat breach, right? What if it's detected? What do we do? So it's more than just information security. And really, if you're a great company, which a lot of companies here are, if you've got some really important intellectual data that makes you competitive, I guarantee you there's people out there right now planning on how to steal that from you, if they haven't already, right? So if you don't have proper controls in place, they're going to take it away from you. And that's my talk. Thank you very much. Do we have time for any Q&A? We do? Okay, great. Thank you.
We have time for 2 or 3 questions. And remember, ask a question, get a DefCamp hat. So who's going to start? Please put your hand up and someone with a mic will come over to you. Let's see who wants to go first. Well, I have a question until someone musters the courage to ask something. You talked about collaborating, of course, with all of the other departments in a company, which is obviously exactly what we need in cybersecurity. Which group is the hardest to convince to kind of join this effort and do something that's consistent and on a longer term?
Yeah, great question. I think that we all have our priorities. We all have that end of the year objective we're trying to meet. All groups have that, HR, finance. And so really making sure that it's part of our goals, not just in information security, but across all the divisions. We talk about security being everyone's job, and I say it's not, actually. I wish it was, but it's not, because only we are rewarded for having good security. Typically, other groups in the company are not. So how do we change that? And once we change that, it's going to change their behaviors to make it a priority. So I can't think of a particular group that's the most difficult, but they're all difficult because they often don't want to spend time working with us to make a holistic plan, even though they're going to be pulled in later once we have a breach, right? So I think making sure that it is a priority, talking to leadership and having that flow down within your company to make sure that they're going to spend time with us and investment and collaborate. So that's what I'd recommend.
Thank you so much for that
sure.
answer. Questions? Oh, we have one over here. I'll just lend you my mic since I'm the closest.
Hello. What's the best approach to protect the organization when the insider threat is within your department, especially when you are on the defensive side, of, in IT or in security?
So I think I heard, what's the best approach when the breach is within your department? Yeah. Yeah, so that can be a bad day. I think that you'll want to make sure you're prepared for that day, because it's going to happen, right? And when it happens, it's usually on a Friday afternoon, half your staff is already gone. It's worst case scenario typically. So the more formalized it already is, then you don't have to think about it as much. You can just follow the process, right? And hopefully you've done some tabletop exercises that includes insider threat, so you kind of know what to do. I find that the collaboration and the communication is one of the first things that can occur, right? So who am I talking to next? And for me, that's quite often leadership. It's like, hey, this has just happened, and this is what I'm planning to do. So I'm not surprising leadership with that. And then quite often then law enforcement's coming in, or even higher than that, right? For me, I've had the agencies come in and work with us, depending on the organization, right? So I think hopefully you're prepared, and then communication would be probably the first thing that I would be looking at. So does that help? Yeah.
Okay, 2 more questions here. We'll take one here and one over there, so we'll make sure we're fair to everyone. And of course, Robert will be around to answer your questions after that. So we'll go for the first here, and then you'll.
Thank you. What's your impression from the majority of companies that you've seen as experienced? Do they proactively work on identifying and working on even putting this in their cybersecurity program, the insider threat, and how many of those companies do it after an incident, as we know how things happen in cyber,
Yeah, so I think I heard how many companies out there do I see that are incorporating insider threat into their information security programs? Yeah, very few from what I see. And it's my hope that there's more of this out there that I just don't see. But typically what I see is this is a bit of an afterthought. And I think that it's when it happens, it's then a surprise of, oh, what do we do now, right? And you're frantically trying to figure out what to do. It's a really bad day, because this has a huge potential to ruin your company, right? Overnight. It's a terrible day for leadership to wake up and realize that all their proprietary data is now public, right? So I find that more times than not, companies are not prepared at all. And I don't know why. My guess is that they just don't think it's a problem that they're going to have. And so they don't put investment into it. And I think part of it is people in information security, you and I, need to make business cases to leadership that say that they must invest in this. Otherwise, they face this damage, right? And really making sure they understand the threat. So, yeah.
Thank you. And one last question over there, if you could please stand up. Thank you.
Yeah, another question it is, what are the most effective methods organization can use to detect and mitigate insider threats, and how can they balance employee privacy with the need for robust monitoring?
One more time, I'm sorry.
Yep. What are the most effective methods organization can use to detect and mitigate insider threats, and how can they balance employee privacy with the need for robust monitoring?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I understood that as how do we protect the company from insider threats, but then also, and detect them, but also respect employee privacy. So yeah, I think very carefully, right? I would look at both the behavioral detection and the technical controls. And if you see a combination of those things occurring, like let's say an employee repeatedly trying to get into a restricted area or repeatedly trying to gain access to restricted data, then there's a conversation that we could have with that employee. Because there might be a valid reason for that, that they could then offer up. But we do have controls in place, so if I swipe my key card on a door and I don't have access, that's going to go into the log, and it's a matter of us seeing that in the log, getting those appropriate alerts, right? But it's a tricky situation, and I think it's also going to depend on your region. So different areas, different countries are going to have different rules for what you can actually look at for behaviors as well, and how you can have those discussions. But that is a tricky area. So, yeah, great question.